series of special webinars on sustainability in lighting. Today's event is organised by Recolight, the UK's leading compliance body for waste, electrical and electronic equipment regulations. I'm Ray Maloney. I'm the editor of the Circular Lighting Report, which is brought to you by Recolight, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. Now, today's webinar is basically a lighting supplier's guide, a guide for wholesalers and end users and producers, and we're going to dive into your obligations under waste legislation. So we're going to look at how you can manage waste, lighting and electrical effectively and while remaining compliant with the law. Now, we have two house speakers this morning, probably the two most experts in their field. First up, we have Lyndsey, who is Customer Service and Collection Development Manager here at Recolight. And next we have Recolight CEO, Nigel, Harvey, who will explain the mandatory digital waste tracking that's coming in, and he'll also bring us up to speed on updates to the regulations, the WEEE regulations, both for household and businesses. So there's our agenda. Lyndsey will be looking at your duty of care, as well as transporting and carrying, receiving and storing waste and the regulations around that. Nigel will be looking at the changes in legislation, the numerous exemptions to that, the effect on wholesalers, the costs, of course, we need to dive into that, and of course the timeline of when all of this is going to happen. And if you could hold your questions till after that, we would welcome your thoughts, your comments, your suggestions. If you would want to use the Q&A box for that, so just put your questions or anything like that into the Q&A box, your observations. The chat box will be monitored by my colleague Suzanne, and that is for webinar admin questions. If you've got problems with sound or you've got any queries about the actual presentation. But the one I will be looking at is the Q&A box, and I'll be putting those questions to the two speakers in about 25 minutes or so when they're finished. We are recording today, so we will have this whole webinar recorded, and it will go in due course onto the website, so you can come back and dive into it and fast forward and all the rest of it. The slides you'll get tomorrow lunchtime. You'll get an email with all the slides on it, so you don't have to take too many notes, etc. So that's the plan for today, and we should finish it around 12 or so, depending on the debate. Just before we get into the webinar itself, a few shameless plugs. On the 2nd of May, we have the Net Zero Conference, and this is a unique event in the sense that it is drawn upon. It's a joint venture between Recolight and the Lighting Industry Association. That's the first time that's ever happened, and the reason being is it's a very timely event, and it's how lighting manufacturers and suppliers can deal with their environmental footprint, their carbon that they generate from their processes. So looking at lighting manufacturing in a low carbon world draws on both organizations' expertise. It's a one-day event, and it's really focusing on the sort of practical steps that suppliers can take to reduce the carbon produced by their operations. So what we'll be looking at there is things like the environmental certification marks, like Planet Mark, B Corp, EcoVadis, etc. We'll be looking at recycled materials, solar installations. Do they work in the lighting industry? We'll be looking at low carbon packaging, a big deep dive in packaging, because that's a quick win. Sustainable logistics and lots of stuff like that. So I really commend this. There's places remaining. So so it's a one-day event, 2nd of May in London, down near Waterloo. So to register, just dive onto the Lighting Industry Association website or the recolight.co.uk and just follow the links, and you'll see the register there. Another event is coming up is Circular Lighting Live, and this one brings together the whole supply chain, suppliers and everybody to look at how we can drive sustainability in lighting. We'll be looking at the hierarchy of lighting, reduce, reuse, recycle, all of that type of thing. We'll also explore EU and UK regulations, the regulatory landscape there. We'll be looking at CAD A installations and how we can reduce waste from them. We'll be looking at material passporting, take-back schemes, urban mining for lights, environmental certifications. Of course, a big chunk of it is metrics, EPDs and LCAs. We'll be looking at biomaterials, 3D printing, luminaire design, the role of AI can play in sustainable design, and of course, recycling. So that is there's also a designers track for the morning. There's also an exhibition there. So that's a one-day event, and I would commend that to you. It's on Wednesday, the 9th of October, slightly earlier than its normal slot. So and as I say, recolight.co.uk and follow the links for that. This is, as I said, this is the first of 3 webinars this year. The next one is on the 22nd of May. It's remanufacturing lighting, the success stories. And we're going to look at some interesting case studies, some commercial projects in London where luminaires have been upgraded, reused, moved from one location to another, etc. And we have 4 excellent speakers: David Clements of Future Designs, John Bowden of Silent Design, Simon Fisher of This Parish, who's also will be representing F-Mark, and Sasha Abiz-Ada, who is the head of architectural lighting at WSP. On the 20th of June, we're going to look at bioplastics for luminaires. We're seeing a lot of new lights with bioplastics, with biomaterials. So we will look into that. Are they right for luminaires? We look at 3D printing with them, etc., and how you handle them at the end of life. And our speakers there are Jamie Norris Green, who's Luminad, which is one of the specialists in 3D printing. Mark Shortland, who is the managing director of Shoplight. They specialize obviously in retail, and they've been using a lot of bioplastics in them in their luminaires. Now we have Julien Vassieres, who is the CEO and founder of Batchworks. So there's a couple of dates for your diary. And finally, I'll give a plug to Circular Lighting Report. And this is, I'm the editor of this, and we basically bring news, views, and stories about what's happening in sustainable lighting in the UK and overseas. So we look at, sustainable luminaire designs, what companies are up to in terms of the environmental marks, etc. We have some interviews with some thought leaders, and you can see all that on the recolight.co.uk/news, or you can also follow us on LinkedIn to keep up with the stories as soon as they break. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Lyndsey, who's going to explore how you can manage your waste electricals. Lyndsey.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning, everybody. So yes, today I'm going to be covering duty of care, carrying waste, what you need to do if you're moving waste, the requirements for receiving waste at your site, and some information on storing waste. So waste producers actually have a duty of care to ensure that their waste is correctly disposed of. And this applies if you produce, you store, collect, or transport waste, or if you receive waste from other people. It's illegal if you don't dispose of your hazardous waste correctly. And it's important to note that the legislation has actually devolved between England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. So the directive has been implemented slightly differently for each of those nations, and there's tweaks along the way, which you'll see in this presentation. So firstly, carrying waste. In England, if you carry waste, you need to register with the Environment Agency as a waste carrier. You need to do this if you transport waste, and therefore you're classed as a carrier. If you buy or sell waste, therefore you're a dealer, or if you arrange for someone else to buy, sell or dispose of waste, and therefore you're deemed as a broker. So if you don't register, you could face an unlimited fine. So it's really important to do this. There's 2 types of waste carrier, lower tier and upper tier, and that it depends on the types of activities that you're undertaking. So you'll actually only need 1 license per company. So you might have a large fleet of vehicles, for example, that are collecting, dropping off waste at different locations, but that 1 license will cover everything. So the lower tier license would apply if you're only carrying waste that you've produced by your own business, unless it's construction or demolition waste, or if you're a charity or voluntary organisation. So the license is free and there's no renewal required. So once you've got it, you've got it. If you carry other people's waste, or you carry your own construction or demolition waste, if you arrange for waste from other businesses businesses to be carried, recovered or disposed of, or if you buy or sell waste or use an agent to do this, then you need to apply for an upper tier carrier's licence. The licence lasts for 3 years, it costs £154, and then once it expires, you can renew it for £105. It's important to say that if any of these criteria apply, then you need to apply for a waste carrier's licence. It's not a case of ticking all of the boxes. So if any apply, then you need to register with the Environment Agency. And you can do that online. And once you're registered, your details would appear on the public register of waste carriers, brokers and dealers. Once you've done that, you'll receive a unique reference registration number, which will be applied on the paperwork, which we'll come on to talk about. Thanks, Susan. So if you're moving waste, you have a duty to ensure that the waste is accompanied by the appropriate paperwork. There's 2 types. One would be a waste transfer note, and one is a hazardous waste consignment note. And the difference simply is that waste transfer notes are used for non-hazardous waste, and hazardous waste consignments obviously are used for hazardous waste. The paperwork gives the agencies the ability to track the movement of waste to make sure that the waste is managed responsibly. So this is an example of a hazardous waste consignment note. So if you're moving waste, you have a legal requirement to make sure this form is completed. This applies if you produce or store waste, if you collect or transport waste, or if you receive waste for recycling or disposal. It's actually a triplicate form. So one copy would be held by the producer of the waste, one by the carrier, and one by the recipient or the consignee of the waste. It has 5 sections. So in part A, you would complete the producer's details. So that's the producer's name and address and where the waste has arisen. Part B would include the details of the waste. So types of waste, the EWC codes, which are European Waste Classification Codes, the hazards in that waste, component, the weights, the quantities, things like that, and how the waste is stored. In part C, the carrier's information would be included. So that would be their vehicle registration number, the name of the company, and their waste carrier's license number, which we've previously discussed. The carrier would sign and date that form, and then part D would be completed by the producer. So they would also sign and date the form to confirm that the above information is true and correct. And then part E would be completed by the recipient or the consignee. And they, to be honest, the information should match. So they would confirm the EWC codes, European Waste Classification Codes, that have been received, the weight, the quantity, etc. And they would also sign and date and state whether they've accepted or rejected that waste. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, there are slight differences. So, for example, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, you would need to pre-notify the relevant agency 3 days prior to moving the waste, but that's not applicable for England and Wales. And incorrect disposal of hazardous waste could result in prosecution, legal costs, reputational damage, and a fine. So in September 2022, the Environment Agency issued a regulatory position statement to confirm that there'd been no enforcement when customers drop off lamps at wholesalers. There is some criteria for that. So, for example, the wholesaler must comply with all other parts of the related legislation. Businesses and contractors should only drop off waste that's arisen as a result of their own activity. The activities mustn't cause pollution to the environment or harm to human health. Wholesalers can't charge can't charge their customers for dropping off waste, and the customers won't be challenged if they don't provide a hazardous waste consignment note to the wholesaler. So the RPS doesn't change the law, and it doesn't apply in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. And ultimately, it just means there's no enforcement that will take place where the above situations arise. And honestly, it removes red tape. It makes it easier for people to dispose of waste. They may not have had access to print the forms out. For example, a contractor may be doing some work and want to drop off their waste lamps at one of our drop-off points at the wholesaler. So they now won't be challenged if they're not able to provide the paperwork. So we've talked about carrying waste and moving waste, and receiving waste on site also has requirements. So you need to complete a consignee return. You need to do this on a quarterly basis with the Environment Agency as you're classified as a consignee. So the return will have details that are similar to the consignment note. So it's just a summary of what's being received on site. And you can complete this form online. So it would also include the EWC codes, the hazards, the physical form that were on the consignment note. And there are fees for this form, which is dependent on whether it's a single receipt of waste or part of a multiple collection. And there's different fees dependent on whether you're submitting it electronically or in paper form. So storing waste. The hazardous waste regulations state that all types of hazardous waste should be stored separately. So sites need to apply for permits dependent on the type and volume of waste they're storing on site. And collection points in England and Wales may need to apply for a storage exemption, or otherwise known as an S2 exemption, which you can obtain from the Environment Agency, and it's free of charge. This exemption allows waste to be stored on site and it's pending recovery elsewhere. There are some conditions to this exemption, and they include that the waste should be stored on an impermeable surface and that it is stored with weatherproof covering. So at Recolight, we advise our collection points to make sure that they store their lamps correctly to avoid lamp breakage. Breakage could result in various hazards, including broken glass, exposure of mercury emissions to our collection suppliers, which is obviously what we don't want. If lamps aren't stacked neatly, the space in the container isn't maximised, and therefore that increases our carbon footprint because we have to collect more frequently. And overfilled containers causes issues because we're unable to collect safely. So you can see on the top picture there an example of a overfilled container. The lamps are just going to topple out and smash all over the floor. The bottom picture is a great example of how we'd ideally like our waste to be stored to avoid lamp breakage. We also ask our collection points to ensure that the lid on their container is secured when it's not being used. And we ask them to make sure that the container is stored in an area where it can't be tampered with or damaged or stolen. Where the lids aren't secure on the container, it means that there's likely to be water ingress in the container, which causes us treatment issues. And if the container is damaged, that may result in lamp breakage. And if it's stolen, then the waste contained in it may not be recovered correctly. So the same applies for luminaires, and we advise that lamps and batteries should always be removed from fittings. They're separate hazardous waste, so therefore they should be stored separately. And contaminated skip loads will be rejected by our treatment suppliers, and it's actually illegal to mix this waste. So the picture on the right shows a fairly well-stacked container full of fittings. They've done their best to avoid contamination by putting their own sign on there, but it could be, the space could be further maximised to reduce our carbon footprint. And just lastly, a snapshot of our reality in customer services. So these are pictures of some of the waste that we've been asked to collect. The challenges obviously include contamination, fly tipping, overfilled containers, and mixed waste. Packaging must be kept separately and treated as a separate waste stream. And it's unlawful to collect hazardous and non-hazardous waste together. It could be a breach of the hazardous waste regulations. Recolight work really, really hard to try and educate and communicate the requirements to our customers. We send out regular newsletters. We have special documents that we prepare for our customers and little guides. And we've got dedicated website pages to help our customers adhere to these requirements to help them do the right thing. Over to Nigel now for his update.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Lyndsey. So, hello, lovely to see so many people on the call today. So I'm going to cover two areas. First of all, a new initiative by the government that's going to seek to digitise all the documentation that Lyndsey's, or much of the documentation that Lyndsey's just been talking about. And then I'm going to go on to look at updates to the WEEE regulations. There was a consultation recently that's closed, and we're going to look at how that might pan out and what the next steps might be. So moving on to look at the digital waste tracking first, I'm going to cover the government's objectives in making this change, what the key changes are going to be, some potential exemptions for businesses and electrical contractors, the possible impact on electrical wholesalers and other collection points as well, what the costs might be, and as always, what the timing is going to be, when this might actually come in. So the government's objectives are really about trying to bring all the documentation, the reporting that Lyndsey described into the 21st century, and looking for central collection of data, where at the moment the data is all collected in a very haphazard fashion by the different environment agencies, and it will give them much better visibility of where the waste goes. And what they're hoping to achieve is to make it easier for legitimate operators to manage their waste correctly, because they just do the right thing anyway, but make it harder for rogue operators and easier for the environment agencies to spot what the rogue operators are doing. And for them, some of the particular issues of concern are fly tipping, the deliberate misclassification of waste, where companies will say that it's actually quite not a problematic waste, when truthfully it's hazardous or dangerous or toxic in some way. And they also want to try to clamp down on illegal waste exports and illegal waste sites. And it's worth pointing out actually that there is quite a lot of organized crime associated with the waste industry. There is unfortunately, quite a dark underbelly, and it's been one of the ways in which organized crime has been able to, sort of seek to legitimize some of the work or some of the things that they do. So this change and digitizing the waste, the waste requirements, was actually the subject of a consultation in 2022, and very pleasingly, all 4 UK nations agreed on this together. So even though, as Lyndsey explained, environmental legislation is actually devolved to the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, this consultation was on behalf of DEFRA for England, the Scottish Government for Scotland, the Welsh Assembly, and the Northern Ireland Assembly. So thankfully, we're getting more consistency in environmental legislation and a little less fragmentation. So what are the key changes going to be? Well, as I mentioned, effectively, it's about eliminating the paper-based records and reports that Lyndsey talked about, including hazardous waste consignment notes and waste tracking notes, and some of those quarterly consignee returns. And the way they're going to do this is effectively set up an online system into which users will enter in real time details of the waste that they are moving. And so what they'll be asked to do is to use the system to record the date and time that a movement is taking place or is being transferred to somebody else, who produced the waste, who it's being sent to, who's carrying the waste, and details of the waste, including the description, the EWC coding that Lyndsey referred to, chemical composition and containment. Broadly, it's similar to the information requirements that are currently in place for a hazardous waste consignment note, except that they're being moved onto a digital platform. And users will be able to do this in 3 ways, either manually via an app into which they can simply enter the data, or they could upload it from a spreadsheet, particularly useful if you've got multiple multiple line items. Or indeed, if you've got a system like Recolight have, where we've got all the information already on our system, a direct data transfer is possible direct to the environment agencies. Importantly, though, there are some quite helpful potential exemptions that are being considered. And the most relevant one to us and to our collection points and partners and members is that incidental waste, that is waste that is generated or moved by businesses that aren't primarily involved in waste management as a primary service, will not be covered. So in essence, if If you're an electrical contractor and you're on a site installing new light fittings or undertaking other electrical work, and you just happen to produce waste as a consequence of your primary work and then move that waste, that is regarded as incidental waste. Wholesalers who might deliver new products to a site and collect some waste while they're there, again, that's a consequence of the primary job, which is selling electrical equipment. And so that would also be incidental waste. And indeed, if businesses move their own waste, well, their main job is doing what the business does, not waste management. And so all of those would be regarded as incidental waste, and digital waste tracking will not be required for the first movement of such incidental waste to a collection point. However, and there's always a however, isn't there? Those waste producers will be required to confirm data that it is entered on their behalf, including for incidental waste. So if you move incidental waste, you don't have to report it yourself and put in all the information, but somebody else further down the line will need to report it, and you will have to go online and click and say, yes, that's what I said it was. So there is still some work, but less than might otherwise be the case. And obviously collection by a waste management company is not incidental waste, because actually waste is their game. So what might be the impact on electrical wholesalers and other collection points? Well, the government announcement does talk about a possible exemption for retailers providing waste take back, but it's not clear that that would be extended to wholesalers. The jury's still out on that. They haven't confirmed either way. I suspect it may not be the case, in which case collection points, certainly those that operate in the Recolight network, will probably need to use the app to record the first movements of waste that are being dropped off using that app. And it's likely, again, to be that same information that we talked about a couple of slides ago, the same information as is currently being entered into the hazardous waste consignment note. There's obviously, there will also be a need to use the app when the waste is collected. So, for example, when a Recolight transporter arrives and picks it up, there will be a requirement to record that on an app and just say, this has been picked up by transporter X. The good news is there'll be no requirement for those quarterly consignee returns, and clearly that makes sense because actually the data is being collected in real time. I'm conscious that this does effectively move the obligation for collecting and inputting the data from the companies that are transporting, from the companies at the moment who are having to put in details into a hazardous waste consignment note and move that information, that obligation moves from the companies moving the waste to the wholesaler collection point. And that is, I can appreciate, is a bit of a concern. It's something, certainly an issue that we're going to be raising with DEFRA, to ask them whether there would still be a need for incidental waste receipts to be recorded on that app, because we can see that that would be quite a big have quite a big impact on Recolight collection points. So what are the costs going to be? And the good news is actually we're not being asked to pay for any of the development costs of the system. It's only the cost of actually maintaining the system. So there'll be no charges for those who are producing or moving incidental waste. And for all others, and those who are involved with actually creating or editing waste records, the cost is simply £20 per year. And that's probably per site rather than per organisation. But either way, it's not a huge number. And what's the timing? Well, the DEFRA say that this is going to be operating on a voluntary basis before the end of 2024, and then mandatory from April 2025. And there's a but, though. And that but is two issues, really. First of all, that there is a it's very, very likely that we will have a general election this year. And to make this happen requires new legislation to be laid before Parliament. Unless they get that out in the next few months, then it's, and if a general election is called in November or October, we go into purdah, I think is it 6 weeks before the general election. So the window for laying new regulations is perhaps starting to close. So that's one of the buts. And the other but is, this is a government IT system, and although there are already users who are checking and working on a beta version of this, with the best will in the world, government IT systems don't have a fantastic record for being delivered on time. But at the moment, they're still saying April 2025, and we'll wait and see what happens over the next few months. So that was a talk through what the way in which the government is seeking to digitize some of those waste records. What I'm now going to do is move on to look at some updates to the WEEE regulations. And the government ran a consultation and a call for evidence, which closed on the 7th of March of this year. And again, very pleasingly, this consultation was run by the government, but on behalf of all 4 nations again. So actually, this is really pleasing. So although the environmental legislation is devolved, they've all agreed the consultation, the call for evidence before it was issued. So this will be UK-wide changes, not different changes in Scotland, Northern Ireland, etc. So those proposals were to seek to drive increased collections of household WEEE through placing new obligations on producers and retailers. The proposals there were actually quite far-reaching, and effectively what it would imply is that every householder in the country over a period of several years would actually be offered and would receive free of charge WEEE collections from the curbside or close to the curbside as we arose. And in fact, I live in St Albans, and in fact we already have in St Albans a curbside WEEE collection. So once every 6 months or so, I put a small bag of WEEE outside and it gets collected. And what they're talking about doing is extending that, which is currently with about 10% of local authorities, and making it nationwide. That may or may not happen reasonably quickly. We'll discuss that in a moment. The next proposal was to seek to make sure that vape producers finance the costs of treating vape WEEE, and vapes are incredibly expensive to recycle, and so it's really important that the costs are separated out and that vape producers themselves pay for them. And also one very close to my heart, and I know to the heart of many in our industry, making sure that online marketplaces actually meet their obligations under the WEEE regulations. That's really important, because there has been a huge level of free riding through online marketplaces, and certainly some work was done not that long ago which looked at the level of non-compliance on online marketplaces. And if you search on Lightbulb on Amazon, something like 75% of all the hits that arise are from companies that are not compliant with the WEEE regulations. So the government is seeking to make sure that that is changed, so that effectively online marketplaces stand in the shoes of producers, and they are they take responsibility for anything sold through their sites that should have been declared properly by the producer outside of the UK. And then separately, they were also looking for evidence and views on measures to drive more circular economy and reuse and remanufacture, to improve the material recovery we get from the recycling process, and to ensure better and more efficient collection and treatment of business WEEE. Next slide, please, Suzanne. So we've been told that 320 consultation responses were received, which is quite a number. And what's interesting is that the biggest number are from local governments. And for them, almost certainly the key issue was this household we collection. And I suspect a very significant proportion of those responses were saying, yes, please, we want to be able to offer producer-financed collections from our from household premises. The next biggest group after that were producers of electrical equipment. That's good that producers were responding. And in fact, we actively encourage Recolight producer members to respond. And I think something like 20 to 25 Recolight members submitted responses to their consultation. That's pleasing because it means that the voice of our industry is being heard loud and clear by government. The other group that's perhaps most pertinent for DEFRA and for the other three national bodies are the trade organisation responses. There were 7% of them were trade bodies, the top left there. So that's probably about 20 trade associations. Certainly the lighting industry put in a very full response, which was great. And those will be particularly influential in shaping DEFRA's response, because obviously those 20 trade associations represent many hundreds of businesses. Next one, please. So what are the likely next steps? Well, there is the government are likely to put in a response before the summer recess. And so we will hear from them both what all the respondents said in summary and also what they are going to do. So initially, we're likely to see a first set of regulations which would cover the essentials, and that is vapes and online marketplaces. But for DEFRA, those are two of the highest and biggest ticket numbers that they want to sort out. The other one that they'd hope to include in this initial set of regulations are obligations on producers to collect from households. However, there was quite a big pushback from many of the respondents, including Recolight, the LIA, and others, which said, well, look, some of the suggestions you make about collecting WEEE from households look like a good idea, but your own modelling shows that it's going to be very costly for really quite a small amount of extra WEEE arising. And so the responses that I was aware of suggested that what was required would be to do a further large-scale trial to have a better grip on the costs and a better grip on the tonnages that are likely to be arising before placing an obligation on the industry. Because in the case of household luminaire producers, it could almost double their WEEE costs for a relatively small increase in WEEE collections. One point that was made by ourselves and many others in their responses was that for household WEEE collections, lamps should be exempted for the very simple reason that lamps are fragile, easy to break, and the waste that is arising at the moment is still very largely mercury containing, and those are just not appropriate for sitting on the curbside waiting for a collector to come along and remove them. So those regulations were planned to be laid before Parliament in 2024, but there's that but again of the general election, and so it seems likely that those will be delayed until 2025. So we'll have at least regulations on vapes and online marketplaces probably in early 2025. The government will then follow on with a second round of regulations that will place further obligations on producers and on distributors, so that we might be seeing a second set of regulations later on in 2025 that require distributors, and that means retailers and wholesalers, to provide what is known as a 1-for-naught collection service. What that means is that a retailer or a wholesaler who sells household or household-like products would be required to provide a take-back service even if they don't sell a new product at the same time. So it's moving the obligation from a one-for-one obligation, which is in existence at the moment. That means I have to provide a take-back service when I sell a new product of a similar nature, to this one-for-naught, which is, if I sell these, then as anyone can come back and drop these off at any point without an obligation to buy them at the same time. So that's going to be quite a big change for wholesalers and retailers. But clearly, it makes it easier for end users and householders and businesses where they are dropping off waste that could have been used by a household. It makes it easier for them to drop off their waste. So that might come in later in 2025 or early 2026. We're also going to see a further consultation, probably in 2025, and they're going to be picking up more on some of the changes in the call for evidence about the circular economy, about encouraging remanufacture, about encouraging reuse. And they will be asking further questions for us all about how we might want to see that implemented. And also on business we, how the business we system might be changed to make it easier for businesses to drop off their we. Their first approach was to ask questions in the call for evidence. That will give them sufficient information to then make some concrete proposals and ask for our collective views on those concrete proposals. And that'll be followed up with yet more regulations in 25 or 26. So this is going to be a fairly drawn out affair over several years, with progressive implementation of new requirements as we work through the following, the next 2 or 3 years. So, Suzanne, next slide. That concludes this presentation. Thank you very much, and be delighted to take any questions.
Great. Okay, thank you, Nigel, for that, sharing your insights and your knowledge there. Lyndsey, if I could invite you to join us again, and we'll start to take some of the questions. I think this first one is, Chris, for you, an anonymous one, Lyndsey. Should luminaires be stored in a dry environment and not in the rain?
So they're okay to be actually stored outside. Most of our collection points would have an open skip that contains their luminaire waste. Obviously, it's very important that the lamps and the batteries are removed from the fittings.
And it has to be a non-permeable surface. Is that correct as well? Yes. You said earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's good. Next one. Does Recolight carry out audits on waste recycling centres and carriers who transport waste from producer to endpoints?
We do. We audit all of our transport and treatment facilities on a regular basis. So that's something that we take very seriously. Actually, we report those findings to our board.
Okay. From Francis Thomas, we have, is there an estimated time frame for the additional WE consultation, e.g. business waste? That's one for you, Nigel, I think.
I think it's going to be sometime next year, because what they're going through the first process of looking at the call for evidence. They'll tell us before recess, so by July, what their views are, but then they are going to consult further. Almost certainly that consultation is going to be next year. Might just be very late this year, but we're back to that issue of the general election, which is unlikely to change any of the positions adopted by DEFRA so far, because actually these aren't really party political issues, they're just common sense issues, but it will almost certainly delay some of them.
From Adriana Sake, I hope I pronounced your name right, Adriana. Is there any information as to the feasibility of extracting CRM specifically from lights of all types, not other WE? CRM, or what is that? What is that?
CRM, critical raw materials, and we're thinking of products like some of the rare earth elements included in, for example, the phosphor powders within fluorescent tubes. And it's a frustration, but it's really difficult to do this. And there have been 1 or 2 examples of technical approaches that can remove the rare earth elements, but they involve some really quite unpleasant solvents, and so it is not routinely done at the moment, and that there isn't a technically and commercially feasible route currently for the extraction of those rare earth elements from phosphor powders. I would really hope that would change, but we're not there yet.
And presumably you have those in lead modules, do you?
Yes, you do. But again, we're talking tiny quantities, Ray. We're talking picogram quantities of some of those rare earth elements. And so concentrating sufficient LED chips to be able to extract some of the rare earth elements is really hard. We were involved in a project that looked at trying to remove gallium from LED chips probably a couple of years ago. And the reality is it was really hard. For a large number of LED lamps, we carefully made sure that the chips were removed and then sought to remove the gallium from it. It was very challenging for a very small amount of gallium.
It's not commercially viable. Russ Dams, I think it's the city of Doncaster, is asking what is designers' responsibilities to specify a reputable manufacturer with circular economy credentials?
I guess the responsibility is that there are not many legal responsibilities at the moment to specify a supplier that adopts circular economy principles. We're more in the area of being the right thing to do, that it's best practice, and that in the long term, it will also make more sense. Because one of the circular economy principles is that something should be capable of being remanufactured or reused or upgraded, and you can upgrade just parts of the product that should be removable and replaceable. And so it just makes sense that actually if you implement or introduce products that are capable of being having only part of the product replaced and upgraded, it's going to be make more sense for the end user rather than having to chuck away the whole product if it's not a modular product.
And is there a responsibility with a reputable manufacturer who is signed up to an official compliance scheme or not?
Oh, it's certainly, if you're buying from a company that isn't a member of a compliance scheme, then you yourself are not breaking the law, but the supplier you're working with is. And I think we'd all only want to work with reputable companies and making sure they're compliant with the WEEE regulations, that they've got the appropriate UKCA or CE marking in place, which is justifiable as well, I think is really important in the procurement specifications for any company.
Wojtek Cheplik is asking, what kind of pressure can or should specifiers apply on the supply chain, especially on fitting manufacturers?
To be honest, I think specifiers are in a great position to work with those fitting suppliers and producers that are leading the way on sustainability and making a difference, because we all know the consequences of what's happening to our planet. And March was the hottest March ever, and you can break down the need to change and act on that into some very small micro issues. And some of the micro issues are about buying from companies that are dealing with sustainability seriously, that have got plans in place to achieve net zero and the like. So specifiers can have a really good role in helping to encourage the industry to be doing the right thing collectively and individually.
Glenn Robertson is asking, is there a collection option for smoke alarm waste?
There is. So it depends whether the smoke alarms are ionizing or non-ionizing. It would determine how we would collect it and arrange to be collected. So if that's something that they're looking for, then just contact us.
Just to add that actually they can be incredibly expensive to recycle, and just as the government is setting up a separate category for vapes because vapes are really expensive to recycle, arguably they should have done the same thing for smoke alarms, because the cost of recycling them is similar to the cost of buying them.
Wow, gosh. An anonymous delegate is saying, our Labour partner, LED Install, takes the lamps to a local wholesaler. What documentation do they need to provide from a legal point of view?
So if they're carrying other people's waste, I'm not sure what the relationship is there, but if they're carrying other people's waste, then they need to have a waste carrier's license. Or actually, if they're carrying their own waste, they need to have a waste carrier's license, upper tier or lower tier. But the RPS, I think, because they're taking the waste to a wholesaler, the RPS would come into place there, so they don't actually need to have a consignment note.
But the RPS only applies in England, though, doesn't it? The
England,
regulatory position statement.
It depends where they are.
In Scotland, Northern Ireland, or Wales, you still need to take one.
It makes it very complicated.
And wasn't there a law change where a contractor dropping off waste, luminaires at his house, doesn't have to have any paperwork, correct?
A contractor dropping off waste
to his wholesaler.
So a wholesaler, yes. So that's the RPS. That's a regulatory position statement that came out from the Environment Agency. So if they're dropping to a wholesaler, and the criteria that I've mentioned on my slides, they wouldn't need to have a consignment note. There wouldn't be any enforcement if they didn't have a consignment note.
So yeah, let's look at the role of contractors. So we've another question here. If an electrical contractor includes the removal of WEEE in its client contract, so it doesn't imply charge for that service, does that make the activity waste management, or could you describe it as incidental?
To me, that would still be incidental, I think.
Yeah, me too.
The primary activity of the business is about providing new stuff or installing new stuff. And even though they're contractually agreeing to take away the waste, it is still incidental. So I've seen an outline of the draft regulations, and I think that would still be covered and described as incidental waste.
So a contractor, in a commercial building, taking out, replacing luminaires, taking out luminaires and dealing with the disposal of them, that will be incidental, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So but he has an obligation under the regulations, correct?
He has an obligation under the current regulations to take a hazardous waste consignment note, although the regulatory position statement in England means it won't be enforced in England. But if the regulations change the way we've been told they're likely to, then it'll be regarded as incidental waste. So from April 2025, all they'll need to do is to confirm that that when the data is entered into the IT system by the recipient, let's say the wholesaler, all they'll need to do is to confirm it is what they were told it was. So limited obligations.
And of course, the presence of fluorescence in those luminaires would create hazardous waste, correct?
Well, fluorescents are hazardous, but most luminaires are hazardous as well.
So, so if you're taking out a LED panel, for instance, if a contractor is taking out a LED panel, that would be classified as hazardous waste, correct?
Yes, correct. Yes. Street lighting is regarded as non-hazardous, but most other commercial lighting is regarded as hazardous.
Really?
For reasons I won't bore you with. Right?
Okay, right. Okay. Even street lighting lamps would, high pressure sodium lamps, etc., would be considered non-hazardous.
Oh no, street lighting fittings are non-hazardous. Street lighting lamps, like SON, absolutely are hazardous.
Yeah, I would have thought so. Yeah. Another anonymous question: does Recolight cover WEEE beyond lamps? If so, what types?
So we collect lamps, luminaires, batteries, and small mixed WEEE. To be honest, we would always say to our customers just to ask. If there's something that's not on our website, just ask. And we work with a number of different treatment facilities, so it may be something that we'll be able to help them with. But the main ones that we advertise are lamps, luminaires, batteries, and small mixed WEEE.
Okay, we've talked about household waste. Nigel, what's the story with the B2B waste? Can we see some changes there coming down the track in terms of legislation?
Potentially quite some big changes, because the question that the government was asking was, does the current B2B WEEE system work well, yes or no? And most people answered a resounding no, because it's really hard as a business end user to try to make sure that the producer of the electrical equipment that is becoming waste is actually obligated and has a duty to collect it. Now, Recolight are unusual. We provide businesses with a free of charge collection recycling of business waste subject to some situations and minimum quantities. That's not the case with most businesses. So for most businesses, if they have business they end up having a responsibility to deal with it themselves. They can't go to a WE scheme like Recolight. And what that means is that far more of it ends up either being dealt with as scrap, just a scrap metal, which means some of the plastics in there are not recycled properly and there are other recycling issues with it, or frankly, they're just get put into a skip and get landfilled. And so what DEFRA are looking to do is to implement a system whereby, subject to minimum quantities, business end users have the right of recourse to ask the producer compliance scheme of which their equipment supplier is a member to come and collect that waste for free, subject to minimum quantities. So actually, it's moving the B2B system a little towards the system that is currently being operated by Recolight and the lighting industry. So the impact on the lighting industry would probably be quite a lot lower than the impact on other industries. But certainly the consequence would be that it's easier for businesses to get their waste dealt with properly because there is an option of free of charge collection recycling via a producer compliance scheme.
Good. Suzanne is asking me to mention that recycling is free for all lamps, but luminaires is free for Recolight members and their customers.
Thank you very much for that.
Just to clarify,
added clarification, Suzanne.
Right. I think I'm in a pronunciation competition here. Monica Andruskovic, hope I got your name right. She is she's a B2C supplier of lighting, business to consumer. Do we need to educate or raise awareness of these regulations to our clients or the receiver?
Currently, the obligation to inform householders of the need to recycle where you're supplying B2C actually rests with distributors and retailers. And so retailers have a duty to inform householders of their need to recycle and of their ability to drop off either in the retail store or at a household waste recycling centre. The system, but with consumer waste is quite different, and in fact there is also a fund of more than £10 million that has been built up over several years, paid for by producer compliance schemes where they miss their target, and that fund has been used to promote awareness of the need for consumers to properly recycle their products. And it's an organization called Material Focus that does that. And they have a character called Hypno Cat, which is a purple cat with some starey eyes, which does a good job of encouraging consumers to do the right thing. So in short, the answer is probably less of an obligation on suppliers of consumer electricals to inform householders of their need to be recycling.
Good. We have an anonymous delegate pointing out that the obligation on the contractor will be to comply with all relevant waste regulations, but the obligation to actually enable WE recovery is with the producer, correct?
Enable WE recovery. Trying to think what the questioner is trying to get at there. I mean, I guess in outline, if the contractor is working on a business's premises, then yes, it's the business whose job it is to obligate the producer to try to find the producer or the producer's compliance scheme and make them responsible for the collection. That is the process that is so complicated at the moment, but which Recolight do on a free of charge basis with Suzanne's clarifications, that process can be quite complicated. And so, but yes, it should sit with the business that is producing the waste, not necessarily the contractor who might be sort of on the business's premises.
And does that happen in the real world? Does a business who's getting in a contractor to upgrade all their lights to LED, for instance, do they know that that's their obligation, or do they?
Often they do, yes. I'm thinking, Lyndsey, we're involved in some large-scale projects, aren't we? And actually, it's the business that is an overall responsibility that actually obligates us, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the requests quite often will come from our members. So it's our members' customers, but the requests come from our members, and then obviously contractors working on site who are the ones who are booking in collections and liaising directly with us. But ultimately, the request comes from the member.
And I know we haven't talked about our favorite subject, which is online marketplaces. So you've got does the regulations change the obligations of we cannot mention any of the names, but online marketplaces who are bringing a lot of lighting into the UK.
Huge quantities. If the regulations get laid early in 2025, which probably seems most likely now, that would place a duty on online marketplaces to start collecting data and providing that data to the environment agencies. That data would be used to establish their market share by weight and by category of the product they have sold in 2025, and that would give them a collection obligation in 2026. So, frustratingly, it's probably still another 18 months before they're going to start paying for their market share. What we're hoping is that if DEFRA publish regulations in the early part of 2025, there might be a way of, even if the online marketplace only collect 6 months of data, then actually all we do is double the 6 months and say, right, you've still got a full year's obligation in 2026, but it's going to be some time, another 18 months at least, before they're paying their fair share, which is very frustrating because this is an issue we have been talking about as an industry for years and years.
But they're important to scope now, which is something to be celebrated.
It is.
Yeah.
Celebrated, although with a hint of frustration that it's taken so long.
Well, it's all about they've argued that we're actually a marketplace, we're not a producer. That's been the argument, hasn't it, for the last decade? Yeah, which is why they've ducked it out. Okay, we're at the top of the hour, and we've also answered all the open questions. But if anybody has some further questions, please feel free to still send them over, and we'll answer them after the event. So well, thank you, Nigel and Lyndsey, for sharing all your expertise, answering all those questions, etc. And hopefully you've clarified the legal situation and the landscape and what's coming down the track for all our participants today. It reminds me to mention a couple of things in May. On the 2nd of May, we had the Net Zero conference in London with the LIA. So as I say, that's on the Recolight website and it's on the LIA website. You can see the full program there and take a view on it and register and join. And on the 22nd of May, we have our second webinar, which is about success in remanufacturing. We're going to look at about half a dozen real world case studies and see how they were successful sustainable projects. So we'll see you hopefully at one or both of those in the coming. I thank you again, Nigel and Lyndsey, and thank you to everybody who participated and asked questions, etc.
And thank you very much, Ray, for hosting. Much appreciated.
Thank you.